The first explosion tore through the morning air like a thunderclap from hell itself. Dirt and rock fragments sprayed into Petty Officer Jake Morrison's face, temporarily blinding him as he pressed himself against the canyon wall. The SEAL platoon had walked straight into a perfectly orchestrated ambush in a V-shaped valley with sheer walls rising 40 meters on both sides. Contact left, contact right. Were boxed in Lieutenant Mason's voice cut through the chaos on the radio steady, despite the impossible situation they'd stumbled into. What was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission to locate enemy artillery positions had turned into a nightmare. The Taliban fighters had the high ground on three sides, raining down PKM machine gun fire, Dragunov sniper rounds, and RPG grenades with devastating precision. The Black Rock Valley had become a kill box, and the SEALs were the targets. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Riker dove behind a boulder as another RPG streaked past close enough that he felt the heat wash over his face. They knew we were coming. This isn't random. The platoon's reconnaissance drone had been shot down within the first 30 seconds of the engagement, leaving them blind to enemy positions. Even worse, two of their radios were experiencing heavy interference, whether from the terrain or enemy jamming equipment, nobody could say. Calls for artillery support went unanswered. Requests for air support vanished into static. 18 SEALs pressed themselves into whatever cover they could find in a natural rock hollow, barely large enough to shelter half that number. It was a temporary refuge at best. At worst, it was a tomb waiting to be sealed. "We need to move, Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Collins," shouted, his voice edged with panic as bullets chipped away at the rock inches above his head. Morrison felt the weight of dread settling into his gut. Collins was right. Their position was untenable. But moving meant exposing themselves to the withering crossfire that had already wounded 3 of their teammates. 70 meters up the canyon wall on a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a prone shooter, Lieutenant Elena Ward adjusted her position behind her MK-13 sniper rifle. She'd climbed up here in the first seconds of the ambush, instinctively seeking the high ground, even as her teammates scrambled for immediate cover below. Through her scope, she surveyed the hellscape unfolding beneath her. Blood stained the rocks where Petty Officer David Chen had taken a round through his shoulder. Hospital corpsman Second Class James Torres was desperately working to stop the bleeding while staying low enough to avoid the incoming fire. 2 others were wounded, one with shrapnel in his leg, another with a grazing shot across his ribs. The enemy had them perfectly positioned. Ward counted at least 40 hostiles spread across multiple elevated positions. Her jaw clenched. This wasn't just an ambush. This was an execution setup. Razor-Falcon to actual, she transmitted, her voice calm despite the chaos. "I have eyes on 3 machine gun nests and what looks like a mortar team setting up on the northern ridge." "Copy that, Falcon," Mason responded. "Can you engage?" Ward's eyes narrowed as she calculated distances and angles. "Negative on the mortar team. They're behind a rock outcropping. I'd need to move to a different position." "Then move. We need that mortar team taken out before they get a firing solution on us." It was already sliding backward off the ledge when another burst of machine gun fire stitched across the rock face where her head had been moments before. The enemy had spotted her muzzle flash. Below, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Chen was growing pale from blood loss despite Torres's efforts. Ammunition was running low, and through it all, the steady crack of incoming fire never ceased. Morrison pressed his back against the boulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He'd been in firefights before, too many to count, but this was different. This felt final. He caught Riker's eye across the gap, saw the same grim recognition there. They were going to die in this valley. Unless someone could change the equation. 3 months earlier, the shooting range at Camp Pendleton had been quiet except for the distant pop of rifles and the occasional bark of a range safety officer. Ward had been alone on the 1,000-meter lane, her Mk-13 steady as she breathed and squeezed. The target downrange exploded, split perfectly down the center by a .300 Winchester Magnum round. Show-off Riker had called from behind her, but there'd been genuine respect in his voice then. 1,200 meters, one shot dead center. That's why they call you Razor-Falcon, sharp eyes, clean kills. The call sign had been bestowed during her first deployment. In a night operation outside Kandahar, she'd taken out 3 targets at distances exceeding 1,000 meters each, her shooting so precise that her spotter had joked she could shave a man with a bullet. Razor-Falcon hawk-eyed and deadly sharp. But call signs could become curses. 6 weeks ago, during an operation in the Kunar province, Ward had taken a shot at an enemy commander from 1,700 meters. The intelligence was solid. The wind calculations were perfect. Her breathing was controlled. She'd done everything right. And she'd missed. Not by much, maybe 8 inches left, but in their world, inches. The enemy commander had dropped behind cover immediately, and in the chaos that followed, Petty Officer 3rd Class Kevin Nash had taken a burst of machine gun fire while trying to flank the position. He'd survived, but he'd lost his right leg below the knee. The investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing. Wind shifts happened. Variables compounded at extreme ranges. Nobody could guarantee a hit beyond 1,500 meters. But her teammates hadn't read the investigation reports. Hey, Falcon, Morrison had said a week later, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Maybe stick to closer targets. Yeah, leave the long shots to people with steadier hands. Collins had been even less subtle. Razor got dull. Might need to sharpen up before someone else gets hurt. And Chief Riker, who'd once praised her shooting, had simply stopped assigning her to overwatch positions beyond 1,000 meters. The message was clear: they didn't trust her anymore. Ward had said nothing. She'd filed no complaints, made no excuses. Instead, she'd spent every spare moment at the range, sometimes shooting until her shoulder ached and her trigger finger cramped. She studied ballistics tables until she could recite them in her sleep. She analyzed weather patterns, learned to read microclimates, practiced breathing exercises used by Olympic shooters. She'd made herself a promise once. She whispered to herself during those long hours of practice, the next time distance matters, I won't miss. But promises meant nothing if nobody gave you the chance to keep them. The doubt had crystallized into something harder over the weeks. At team briefings, other snipers got the high-value target assignments. In planning sessions, her input was acknowledged but rarely acted upon. She'd become invisible in the way that only failure could render someone invisible, still present, still part of the team, but fundamentally discounted. The final insult had come 2 weeks before this deployment. During a mission, Brief Lieutenant Mason had assigned the overwatch position to Petty Officer Jake Morrison instead of Ward, despite Morrison having a quarter of her confirmed kills. No offense, Ward, Mason had said, not quite meeting her eyes. But we need reliability on this one. She'd simply nodded and accepted her assignment to the entry team. That night, alone in her quarters, Ward had pulled out a photograph she kept in her gear bag. It showed her with Petty Officer 1st Class Thomas Garrett, her spotter from her first deployment. Garrett had been killed by an IED 8 months ago, just weeks before his rotation home. If the team ever loses their eyes, you'll be the last one they've got, Garrett had told her once, sitting on a rooftop in Fallujah while they waited for a target to appear. That's what Razor-Falcon means, Elena. Not just that you're sharp, that you're the blade they can count on when everything else has failed. She'd tucked the photo away and gone back to the range. Now pressed against cold Afghan rock, with bullets singing overhead, and her teammates dying below, Ward understood that this was her moment. The universe didn't give you chances to prove yourself, it gave you disasters and asked if you were ready. She keyed her radio. Razor-Falcon to actual. I'm repositioning for a shot on that mortar team. There was a pause. Then Mason's voice tight with stress. Falcon. Ward had already done the calculations. She'd spotted the mortar team through a gap in the rocks, seen the telltale shape of an 82 mortar tube being assembled, watched the enemy spotter setting up a rangefinder. 2,600 meters actual. The radio went silent for 3 full seconds. Say again? Falcon, did you say 2,600 meters? Ward was already moving, scrambling across the rock face toward a higher position that would give her an angle on the mortar team. 2,600 meters was beyond the effective range of her rifle, far beyond what any reasonable sniper would attempt in combat conditions. Confirmed. 2,600 meters. She heard Morrison's voice break in. That's insane. Nobody can make that shot. Falcon, this is Chief Riker. The senior NCO's voice was stern. Maximum effective range on your rifle is 1,800. You're talking about adding another 800 meters. The bullet drop alone. I'm aware of the ballistics, Chief. Ward had reached a new position now, a precarious ledge, barely 40 centimeters wide with a sheer drop below. She unfolded her bipod, settling the rifle with practiced movements. But that mortar team is about to rain shells on our position. I don't see another option. Below, the firefight intensified. The Taliban had realized the SEALs were pinned and were beginning to maneuver for an assault. Ward could see 3 separate groups of fighters moving through the broken terrain, advancing by bounds, while others provided covering fire. They had maybe 5 minutes before the enemy closed to grenade range. Less if the mortars got operational. Falcon, if you miss, you give away your position for nothing. They'll zero in on you. Sir, if I don't shoot, we're dead anyway. Ward began her calculations, factoring in wind speed, temperature, altitude, the Coriolis effect at this range. At 2,600 meters, I'm looking at a bullet drop of approximately 22 meters. Wind is variable, shifting between the valley floor and the ridgeline. I'll need to account for rock fragments peppered her arms. Falcon, your position is compromised, Riker shouted. Pull back. But Ward had her eye pressed to the scope now, watching the mortar team through the magnification. She could see the enemy spotter, likely an officer given his cleaner uniform and the way the others deferred to him. He was directing the placement of the mortar tube, adjusting it for the proper elevation. In about 90 seconds, that mortar would be ready to fire. Negative, Chief. I'm taking the shot. God damn it, Ward. That's not even. Chief. Ward's voice cut through, quiet, but absolutely firm. You wanted reliability. Let me be reliable. She heard Morrison mutter something that might have been a prayer or a curse. Through her scope, Ward made her final adjustments. The wind was the biggest variable at this distance. A wind shift of even 2 miles per hour could cause a miss of several feet. She watched dust devils swirling in the valley, studied the movement of loose fabric on the enemy soldiers' clothing, calculated the thermal layers that would affect the bullet's trajectory as it arced high above the battlefield. 22 meters of drop. Adjust scope elevation to compensate. Wind right to left, approximately 8 miles per hour at her position, maybe 6 at target elevation. Adjust windage 3 minutes of angle, right? Temperature was 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Altitude just over 4,000 feet. Spin drift would pull the bullet slightly right over this distance. Add another quarter minute. Her finger found the trigger, her breathing slowed. And then she hesitated. The memory of Nash screaming as blood poured from his shattered leg flashed through her mind. The weight of 1,700 meters of 8 inches left of catastrophic failure. Falcon Mason's voice was almost gentle. If you're not confident, I'm moving to firing position, Ward interrupted. She settled herself fully behind the rifle, her body molding to the weapon with the familiarity of thousands of hours of practice. Through the scope, she saw the enemy officer step up to the mortar's sight, making final adjustments. In moments, he'd give the order to fire. Ward's world narrowed to the circle of her scope, to the rise and fall of her breath, to the steady beat of her heart. 58 beats per minute. 56. She waited for the natural pause between heartbeats, the moment when her body was stillest. Below, Torres was shouting that Chen was going into shock from blood loss. Morrison and Collins were returning fire, but their ammunition counters were dropping toward empty. Riker was trying to coordinate a fighting withdrawal that everyone knew was impossible under this volume of fire. Her teammates were dying. Razor-Falcon Ward whispered to herself so quietly that her radio didn't pick it up. Time to prove the blade isn't dull. She exhaled, halfway held it, and squeezed. The Mk-13 bucked against her shoulder, the suppressor reducing but not eliminating the sharp crack of the shot. The .300 Winchester Magnum round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, immediately beginning its long arcing journey across the valley. 4 seconds. That's how long the bullet would be in flight. For Ward, those 4 seconds stretched into eternity. Second one, the bullet climbed fighting gravity, its copper jacket gleaming as it caught the morning sun. 2,600 meters downrange, the enemy officer leaned over the mortar site completely unaware. He began to call out firing data to his crew. Below Ward's position, Morrison took a round through his vest plate that knocked him flat. He gasped for air, certain his ribs were broken but alive. For now. Second two, the bullet reached the apex of its trajectory, nearly 50 feet above the valley floor. Wind buffeted it, a gust from the west that Ward hadn't fully anticipated. The round drifted 4 inches left of her point of aim. Torres pressed his hands against Chen's shoulder wound, but blood was pooling beneath them faster than he could control it. Chen's lips were turning blue. "We have to move him," Torres shouted. "He needs a trauma surgeon now." But there was nowhere to move. Nowhere safe. Second three, the bullet began its descent, accelerating under gravity's pull. The enemy officer placed his hand on the mortar tube, ready to give the command to fire. The first shell was already loaded. Range 400 meters. Target the rock hollow where the SEALs sheltered. Lieutenant Mason pressed his rosary into his palm, the beads cutting into his skin. He'd led 18 men into this valley. He couldn't bear the thought of only carrying dog tags out. Second 4, the bullet dropped below the ridgeline, screaming toward its target at over 2,000 feet per second. The enemy officer opened his mouth to shout fire. And then the world went silent. The .300 Winchester Magnum round punched through the officer's ranging scope, through the glass and metal and precision optics, and into his face. He dropped without a sound, his body crumpling beside the mortar tube. For a moment, nobody moved. The enemy mortar crew stared at their dead officer, trying to process what had just happened. The SEALs stared up at the ridgeline, waiting for the shells to fall. Then Chief Riker's voice exploded across the radio. 2,600 meters. One shot. Center mass. The battlefield transformed in an instant. The enemy mortar crew abandoned their positions, scrambling for cover. The Taliban fighters, who'd been advancing so confidently, suddenly found themselves without fire support, without coordination, without the commander who'd been directing their attack. Ward didn't celebrate. She was already acquiring her next target, a Dragunov sniper who'd been terrorizing the trapped SEALs from an elevated position. Range 1,900 meters. She adjusted her scope, breathed, fired. The enemy sniper toppled backward off his perch. "Falcon's gone hunting," Morrison shouted, his voice filled with something between shock and joy. He popped up from cover, his M4 chattering as he engaged targets with renewed vigor. Below, the equation had changed. The SEALs were no longer helpless prey waiting for death. They were warriors with a guardian angel 3,000 feet above them, and that angel had teeth. Ward cycled the bolt, chambering another round. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but her hands were steady as stone. Through her scope, she found another target, an RPG gunner taking aim at Torres and Chen. Range 2,100 meters. She fired. The gunner collapsed his RPG, clattering unfired down the rocks. 3 for 3 Collins whooped. Falcon's back. Ward allowed herself the smallest smile. Then she found her next target. With the mortar threat eliminated and their sniper providing devastating overwatch, the SEALs began to push back. Lieutenant Mason coordinated the assault with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, each movement timed to Ward's rhythm of fire. Team 1 bound left on Falcon's next shot. Ward fired. A Taliban machine gunner jerked and fell. Morrison and Collins sprinted 30 meters to better cover their movements, covered by both Ward's precision fire and suppressive bursts from Riker's Me-249. Team 2, prepare to move on my mark. Another shot from above. Another enemy fighter down. The second team advanced, securing a position that allowed them to begin flanking the enemy's right side. The Taliban fighters were in disarray. They'd set up a perfect ambush, had every advantage, had the Americans exactly where they wanted them. And then a single sniper had changed everything. Now they were the ones being hunted, picked off one by one by an invisible shooter whose accuracy seemed almost supernatural. Ward shifted positions between shots, never firing more than twice from the same location. She'd learned that lesson long ago. A stationary sniper was a dead sniper. Rock chips exploded around her as enemy fighters tried to zero in on her muzzle flash. But she was always somewhere else by the time their rounds arrived. 1,900 meters chest shot on an enemy commander trying to rally his men. 2,200 meters headshot on a spotter calling out American positions. 1,800 meters, 3 rounds in rapid succession, each one finding a different target, each one a kill. Her barrel was getting hot now, the sustained fire pushing the weapon beyond its usual operating temperature. She could feel the heat radiating through the handguard, could smell the acrid scent of burned powder. But she didn't slow down. Below, Torres had finally stabilized Chen enough to move him. The SEAL team was executing a fighting withdrawal, moving in coordinated bounds toward the valley's eastern exit. But the enemy hadn't given up. They were regrouping, preparing to cut off the American escape route. Falcon, this is actual Mason called. Enemy reinforcements moving in from the northeast. I count at least 15 hostiles with RPGs and machine guns. They're gonna block our only exit. Ward swung her rifle toward the northeast, scanning for the new threat. She found them a larger force than Mason had estimated. Maybe 20 fighters moving with the discipline of trained soldiers rather than irregular militia. These weren't local Taliban. These were foreign fighters, probably Chechen or Uzbek veterans with years of combat experience. And they were about to slam the door shut on the SEALs' escape. I see them actual. Range is 2,400 meters. Can you engage? Ward counted 6 RPG gunners in the group. If even one of those rockets found its mark while the team was moving through open ground, casualties would be catastrophic. Affirmative. I'll suppress them, but I need you to move fast. I can't hold them forever. Understood. All teams prepare to move on Falcon's signal. Ward took a breath. 6 targets, 2,400 meters, probably 90 seconds before they reached firing positions. She'd have to work faster than she ever had before. She picked her first target, the lead RPG gunner, and fired. Miss. The round hit low, kicking up dust 2 feet in front of the target. Damn. The wind had shifted again. She adjusted, fired again. Hit. The gunner went down. But now the enemy force knew where the shots were coming from. They scattered, seeking cover, making themselves harder targets. Ward didn't panic. She breathed, adjusted, found her rhythm. Second target, 2,300 meters, moving left to right. She led him by 3 feet, squeezed. Down. Third target, 2,400 meters, prone position behind a rock. She waited for him to shift to expose himself for just a moment. There. She fired. Down. Go! 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 Ward worked her bolt like a machine, selecting targets, calculating ranges, firing. 2 more RPG gunners went down. Then a machine gunner who'd been setting up to rake the fleeing Americans. But there were too many. For every enemy fighter, she dropped 2 more, seemed to take his place. And she was running low on ammunition. 20 rounds left in her magazine. Maybe 30 more in her pouches. Falcon were taking fire, Morrison called. They're zeroing in. Ward saw it happening. The enemy force was splitting, half continuing to pursue the SEALs, while the other half turned their attention to finding and eliminating the troublesome sniper. Tracers began streaking toward her position, close enough that she could hear them snapping past. A burst of machine gun fire chipped the rock inches from her head, showering her with stinging fragments. She had a choice to make: continue providing overwatch and risk getting killed, or withdraw to safety and leave her teammates exposed. It wasn't really a choice at all. All teams, this is Falcon. Her voice was calm, steady. Continue your withdrawal. I'll maintain overwatch. Negative, Mason barked. Falcon, you're compromised. Pull back now, that's an order. Ward lined up her next shot, another RPG gunner at 2,300 meters. Respectfully, sir, I'm exactly where I need to be. She fired. The enemy had finally figured out her position, and they were pouring everything they had at the ledge where Ward lay prone. The air around her was alive with bullets, a constant whip crack of near misses that would have terrified a lesser shooter. Ward felt nothing but focus. She'd entered what her old spotter Garrett used to call the zone, that state of absolute clarity where time seemed to slow, where the chaos of battle faded into background noise, where nothing existed except the target in your crosshairs and the trigger under your finger. 12 rounds left. An enemy fighter popped up from cover to fire an RPG at the fleeing SEALs. Ward's shot caught him in the chest. The ERPG fired wild, exploding harmlessly against the valley wall. 11 rounds. A machine gun team tried to set up a flanking position. Ward put a round through the gunner's shoulder, then a second through the assistant gunner's leg. The gun fell silent. 10 rounds. 9. Below, Riker and Morrison had reached the valley's eastern edge, where a narrow defile would provide covered passage to the extraction point 3 kilometers away. They were setting up a defensive position to cover the rest of the team's withdrawal. 8 rounds. 7. Torres and 2 other SEALs were carrying Chen, moving as fast as they could while bearing the weight of their wounded teammate. They were exposed, vulnerable. An enemy sniper took aim at them from a ridgeline position. Ward saw him, ranged him 1,800 meters, and fired before he could get his shot off. 6 rounds. Falcon, everyone's through, except you, Mason called. Get out of there now. Ward began her crawl backward off the ledge, but movement caught her eye. 3 enemy fighters were attempting to flank the SEAL's defensive position, moving through a crack in the rocks that would bring them out directly behind Riker and Morrison. If they succeeded, they'd massacre the SEALs from behind while the rest of the team was still evacuating. Ward stopped retreating. She settled back behind her rifle. Falcon, what are you doing? Move. 3 hostiles attempting to flank your position, Chief. Engaging. 5 rounds. 4. 3. The flanking team died before they reached their objective, cut down by precision fire from a shooter they never saw. Now Ward did retreat, sliding backward off the ledge, just as a concentrated burst of machine gun fire tore through the position where she'd been lying. Her rifle sling caught on a rock protrusion, yanking her to a stop as bullets chewed through the air above her head. She freed the sling with a hard jerk that nearly dislocated her shoulder, then began a controlled slide down a rock face that was more cliff than slope. Bullets followed her descent, striking sparks off the stone. 20 meters from the bottom, her boot slipped. She fell the last 4 meters, landing hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Pain lanced through her left ankle, not broken, but badly twisted. "Falcon's down," Collins shouted. He'd been watching through binoculars from the defensive position. She fell. Ward dragged herself to her feet, testing the ankle. It screamed in protest, but held her weight. She could move. That was enough. She began running, or rather limping quickly, toward the defile where her team waited. The enemy saw her, now knew she was exposed and vulnerable. Fire concentrated on her position, churning the ground around her feet into a maelstrom of dust and rock chips. 50 meters to safety. An RPG streaked past so close that the heat singed her hair. 40 meters. She felt the impact before she heard the sound. Something punched her hard in the back, spinning her around. She stumbled but didn't fall, kept moving forward. 30 meters. Covering fire, Riker bellowed, and the entire SAAL team opened up, pouring suppressive fire back at the enemy positions to give Ward those last few precious seconds. 20 meters. Her legs felt like lead. Each step was a small agony. The tactical vest felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. 10 meters. Strong hands grabbed her, yanking her into the defile's mouth. Morrison and Collins pulled her down behind cover as bullets traced their path, striking the rock wall where she'd been standing. Ward collapsed against the stone, gasping for breath. Her back felt like someone had hit her with a baseball bat, but when she reached around to check, her fingers found the deformed remains of an armor plate that had stopped a rifle round. She'd been shot. The plate had saved her life. "You insane, beautiful, crazy," Morrison was laughing and crying at the same time. 2,600 meters, you actually made that shot. Ward managed a weak smile. "Told you." The blade wasn't dull. The extraction point was a rocky hilltop 3 kilometers from the Valley of Death. 2 Black Hawk helicopters, set down in a storm of dust and rotor, washed their door gunners, scanning for threats, while the SAAL team loaded their wounded. Chen was first aboard, unconscious now, but stable. Torres had worked miracles with the medical supplies available, but the wounded SCAAE needed a trauma surgeon's hands and equipment that didn't exist this far into the mountains. The rest of the team loaded quickly, efficiently, with the practice movements of men who'd done this too many times. As Ward limped toward the nearest helicopter, Riker stepped in front of her. The chief looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he did something Ward had never seen him do before. He reached up and removed the patch from his shoulder, the one marked with the SEAL trident and their unit designation. Using a marker from his vest, Riker wrote something on the back of the patch. Then he pressed it into Ward's hand, closing her fingers around it. "Read it later," he said, his voice rough. "When you're alone." Before she could respond, he wrapped her in a crushing hug that made her injured back scream in protest. She didn't care. "I'm sorry," Riker whispered in her ear, "for doubting you. For the things I said. For not being better." Ward felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "We all miss sometimes, Chief. It's how you adjust for the next shot that matters." As the helicopter lifted off, Ward looked down at the valley they were leaving behind. From this height, it looked peaceful, almost beautiful. Just another fold in the endless mountains that stretched toward the horizon. You couldn't see, the blood couldn't hear, the screams couldn't smell the cordite and death. Morrison dropped into the seat beside her, having to shout over the rotor noise. Mason's putting you in for a Silver Star, maybe even the Navy Cross. Ward shook her head. Just doing my job. Your job? Collins leaned in from across the cabin. Your job was to shoot at reasonable ranges. You just made the longest confirmed kill shot in this entire theater. That's not just your job, that's legend status. The longest shot, Ward frowned. How do you know that? Morrison grinned and held up his tactical tablet, which somehow still had satellite connection. Mason already filed the preliminary report. 2,600 meters, one shot under combat conditions. There's going to be people arguing about this for years. Ward didn't care about records or medals or what people would say. She cared about the fact that 18 men were on these helicopters heading home when an hour ago, it had looked like nobody would leave that valley alive. She opened her hand and looked at Riker's patch. On the back, in his blocky handwriting, he'd written, RAZORFALCONSHARPESTBLADENIGAUSVEE. Ward folded the patch carefully and tucked it into her vest pocket right next to the photograph of Garrett. Hey, Falcon Torres called from where he sat monitoring Chen's vital signs. When we get back. First round's on me. You drink whatever you want, however much you want. Make that the whole night on me, Morrison added. Hell, the whole week. Ward smiled despite her exhaustion and pain. Just one round will be fine, and then I want to go to the range. They stared at her. The range after today, you want to go shoot more. I want to see if I can push it to 2,700, Ward said simply. There's always room for improvement. The SEALs burst into laughter, the kind of laughter that only comes after surviving something that should have killed you, the laughter of men who stared into death's face and walked away. PARTEIGHTONEWEEKLATER. The range at Camp Pendleton was quiet in the early morning, the way Ward preferred it. She'd been cleared for light duty after the doctors examined her bruised back and twisted ankle, which meant she was free to do what she always did when she needed to think shoot. She was alone on the 1,000-meter lane when she heard footsteps behind her. She glanced back to see Lieutenant Mason approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, offering her one. You've been out here since 0500. Ward accepted the coffee gratefully. Can't sleep, sir. Every time I close my eyes, I see that valley. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. It'll fade. Eventually. He paused. I also came to tell you that your Silver Star was approved. They're doing the ceremony next month. That's... Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. You earned it. Mason sipped his coffee, watching as a target carrier moved downrange. I also came to apologize. Ward turned to face him fully. Sir, for doubting you, for letting one bad shot define how I saw you instead of looking at your entire record, for not giving you the chances you deserved. Mason's jaw tightened. You're the best sniper I've ever worked with, Ward. And I let politics and fear make me forget that. I did miss that shot, sir. At 1,700 meters. You're human. Humans miss sometimes. Mason met her eyes. From now on, when I need the best shooter, I'm putting you in position. No hesitation. No doubt. Understood. Yes, sir. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Mason asked. Ward gestured at the far target. trying to push my maximum effective range. If I can add another 100 meters to my capabilities, you're already the best. You don't have anything left to prove. I'm not trying to prove anything, sir. Ward settled behind her rifle, her eye finding the scope. I'm trying to be ready for the next time distance matters. And if there is no next time, if you never have to take another shot like that, Valley? Ward's finger found the trigger, her breathing slowed, her heart rate dropped. Then I'll be ready anyway, she said, and fired. Downrange, the target took the round dead center, 2,300 meters away. Ward cycled the bolt, chambering another round. In her mind, she was already calculating the adjustments for 2,400, because that's what Razor-Falcon did. She stayed sharp. She stayed ready. And when her team needed her, when distance mattered, and seconds counted and lives hung in the balance, she made the shot. Every single time. Lieutenant Elena Ward's 2,600-meter shot entered military record books as the longest confirmed kill by a female sniper in U.S. military history and one of the longest confirmed kills under combat conditions by any sniper. More importantly, it saved 18 lives and became a turning point in how female operators were viewed in special operations units. The call sign Razor-Falcon, once given in praise and then tainted by doubt, was restored to its original meaning, a blade sharp enough to cut through the impossible eyes, keen enough to see what others missed, and a warrior who never stopped honing her edge. Chen recovered from his wounds and returned to active duty 6 months later. Nash, who'd lost his leg in the operation that had shaken Ward's confidence, attended her Silver Star ceremony and publicly stated that he'd trust Ward with his life or any long-distance shot without hesitation. And on a quiet morning range at Camp Pendleton, if you arrive early enough, you might still find a lone figure behind a rifle pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Because some people prove themselves once and rest on their laurels. Others prove themselves once and get back to work. Razor-Falcon was always the latter.